Welcome everybody to tonight's class. So firstly, I want to thank everybody for partaking in yesterday's charity and for making it all possible. Your support goes a great way. And it's actually very nice and apropos, Hashgacha Pratis, by divine providence, that this week's Torah portion talks about the first crowdfunding event in history. And that is when Moshe Rabbeinu had to collect, or was commanded to collect from the Jewish people in order to build the Mishkan, the tabernacle that traveled with them in the desert and for close to 500 years in Eretz Yisrael. So it was the first of its kind in history, and many have been modeled after it. However, there was something novel about it that I'm pretty sure in history hasn't happened since. And that is that the collectors in the desert had to say, enough, we have everything that we need. I'm not sure that there's ever been an event like that in history where there was crowdfunding and the collectors said, enough, we have what we need. But anyways, we find something fascinating. It's easy to say that the greatest thing in history to ever be created was the world that we know of, the entire universe, the physical universe that we know of, creation of everything. And according to our tradition, that 5,781 years ago, that the world was created by God in 6 days. And on the seventh day, God rested. Fascinating how the Torah, when describing this experience, the greatest event in history, the greatest creation in history, the Torah uses about roughly 31 verses to describe creation. We find something fascinating. When it comes to the description of the Jewish people raising funds and building the tabernacle, the tent that traveled throughout the desert with them, the house of meeting with God where they brought the sacrifices, the Torah spends 371 verses in order to describe that experience. You think about it. We're talking about a structure that was roughly 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, and the Torah uses 371 verses. When it comes to the world, that the observable world's universe, really, I should say, spans about 93 billion light years. I'm not even sure you can compare 150 feet by 75 to 93 billion light years. You can't. It's almost an infinite difference. However, when the Torah describes it, very interesting, only 31 verses. But over here, the Torah is giving us an extremely profound message. For an infinite God to create a finite home for man is nothing. As our sages even tell us, that where do you see God's greatest humility is in the creation of our world, because it's literally nothing relative to what God truly is. However, when a human being will create a sanctuary for God, when a human being makes good choices, moral acts, and does what's right, that is the greatest thing that God considers. And that is truly a great victory. And that's why the Torah specifies every single detail of it. You see, it's interesting. When you look at how detailed the Torah is when it comes to the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the Torah gets into every little detail, even the lineup of the hoops and the loops and the hooks and the loops. Every single detail. Then even when it comes to the dimensions of it, every single detail is there. In addition to that, we find something else that's interesting, that many of the measurements are half measurements. 3.5 amas, 3.5 cubits. Why not 4? Why not 3? Why a half? These two ideas of the details and the half measurements give a very profound lesson to us, and that is that in our lives, we know that our lives are made up of many details, and most of the details in our lives seem completely mundane. It's not every moment that you have a life-changing moment. But that's where the Torah comes to tell us, no. In every single detail that can be life-changing, and look at each detail like that, because it's each of these details that create this tapestry, that build this home for God. And along with that is the half measurements, is because at the end of the day, we're not perfect people. Nobody is perfect. Nobody living and breathing is a perfect human being. However, even in the half measures, there is still what to be used. And in our fragmented world, what to be used in order to create a home and a sanctuary for God. And that isn't everything that we come across. Now, back to the desert, back to the structure that they're building. So the Jewish people are going to build this physical structure that will, like I said before, will travel with them for 40 years in the desert, and then close to another 500 years in the land of Israel, till eventually they will build the first Beis HaMikdash, which will last for 410 years, and the second Beis HaMikdash, Holy Temple, which will last for 420 years. The question is, what is the purpose of this tent, and what are the purposes of the following structures that will take its place? Why do we need a physical dwelling place for God? Is God not found everywhere? Is God not infinite? What's the purpose of this physical structure? So there are a few approaches in the commentaries into how to understand this. The first approach we're going to take is from the Sefer HaChinuch, which is authored by the Levite of Barcelona. We don't know much about him, besides that he was a Levite from Barcelona roughly in the 12th or 13th century. And he explains as follows. The way that God deals with us as human beings is according to our limitations and according to our strengths. God understands us, and therefore God always deals with us on our level, on our playing field, in a way that we can actually show up. And one of the things we know about human beings is how dependent we are on our five senses. And that's how we experience everything in the world, is through our five senses. And then we develop that information and we live life based on that. And if that's the case, if we were not to have a physical place to be able to connect with God and to serve God, we would be lacking that aspect of our relationship with God and our relationship in life. And therefore God says, build me a physical structure where I will dwell amongst you. But why? For the sake of the human experience, that it should become much more real and something experienced by our five senses. That when a person would go to the Beis HaMikdash, they would see, they would hear, they would feel, they would smell, and they would be able to taste. And like this, it'll be a full sensory experience and will become a part of it. On the same vein of this approach comes Rabbi Don Yitzchak Abarbanel from the 13th century, Spanish sage, and he explains, 14th century sage, he explains as follows. What it's trying to impress on us, what God is trying to impress on us by creating a physical structure to house the dwelling place of God, where we go, so to say, to meet God, as the tent was called, the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, was to impress upon us that God is found in this physical world. As we know throughout history, there have been many, many philosophers and schools of thought that God does not exist in the physical and in the mundane. And this was to teach us that God is very much present in the physical. And God says, make me a physical dwelling place and I shall dwell there. As well as ingraining within us that God is always looking out for us. God is always watching us, and God knows what is going on within ourselves, within our physical world. And by having this structure, it would remind us of that and impress that upon us, and we would be able to live with these ideas. On the other extreme, we find that the Rambam, Maimonides, in his book, The Guide for the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim, the way he explains it is a little bit extreme, and some are a little bit uncomfortable because the ideas he intimates there, but we're not going to settle the issues that they have within, even though they are very easily settled. At least most of these issues are very easily settled. And he explains that, similar to what we spoke about last week, that God never comes to the Jewish people in order to completely change their nature. In other words, Hashem would not take something away from us. Hashem slowly weaned the Jewish people off of many practices. And the way Hashem would do that is first by giving a mitzvah. And that mitzvah would, so to say, make that shift in our lives. And ultimately, we would grow beyond that. So one of the examples he gives of this is using physical items in order to serve God. In other words, a housing for God, a physical place for God, would only be something that, because the Jewish people were so steeped and used to idol worship, so they needed a physical place, a physical representation, so to say, of God. And God says, you know what, I understand that this is where you guys are coming from, so let me give you a mitzvah of building a physical house with physical cherubs and a physical table, a shulchan, an altar, a place that you can offer sacrifices to me, a place you can offer bread to me. And like this, it won't be too extreme for them, the shift of where they were coming from to what they were going to be when serving God. And that's what God was giving them. Now, as extreme as this sounds, the Rambam is really taking this from a Sefarno. This is a midrashic work compiled in the 3rd and 4th century in Babylonia. And over there, the Sefarno explains that before the sin of the Egel Hazav, of the golden calf, there actually was no need for a temple. There was no need for this traveling tent, place of meeting God. And there wasn't even a need for Kohanim, for priests. Before the sin of the golden calf, God was going to deal directly with every single human being, every single Jew. There would be no need to go to a particular place bound by time or space. And it would be direct with every single human being, the same way it was in the Holy of Holies. However, because of the sin of the golden calf, that created a certain separation between the Jewish people and God. And therefore God said, you know what, build this housing, and it's this housing that will present a medium where Creator and creation will meet, and the Jewish people will be able to come there. Really, the nations of the world will be able to come there to experience that when necessary. Now, and according to the Rambam, based on the explanation we just gave before, his whole idea is that the Jewish people, after getting used to coming to the Beis HaMikdash or the Mishkan enough, would be able to start connecting with Hashem in that sense. Another approach that we have, and this is from the Khazari. The Khazari was a 12th century sage, poet, philosopher, an amazing person known as Yehuda Halevi. The reason why he wrote or compiled this book called the Khazari, one of the greatest Jewish philosophical works ever written, was there was a little country called Khazar, somewhere near Siberia. And if I'm not mistaken, in the 7th century it was established. Rabbi Doobie Lisker lived a couple of hundred years after that. But at this point, the royalty of the country wanted to convert to the religion of truth. And the way that the Khazari is written is this king of Khazar is sitting down with a rabbi, a sheikh, and a priest, and they are discussing the different religions, or as he calls it, the religion of truth. And he asks them extremely philosophical questions, and he waits for each one to respond. And eventually, after different stages of progression, he asks the one he's least satisfied with to leave. Ultimately, he's left with the Jew, the Jewish sage, and they continue to talk for hours. And it's all a recording of that. Whether this story actually happened this way or it was only written this way afterwards isn't as relevant to our conversation tonight. I would just like to read a little piece for you. And he writes as follows. Sorry, let me just find it. Here. But we have already stated, this is obviously a translation of what was originally written in Arabic and in Hebrew. And he writes as follows. But we have already stated that it is impossible to become close to God without the divine commandments themselves. This is because God alone knows the proper measurements, weights, times, places, and all else that is tied into the practices of these commandments, which when performed properly lead to divine favor and attachment to divinity. Such exactitude is found in the construction of the tabernacle, where when describing each act of construction, the Torah says that Bezalel made the ark, or he made the ark cover, he made the curtains, etc. By all of these, it says, just as God had commanded Moshe. This means that it was done without any addition or deletion. Nothing in the tabernacle's construction makes sense to us or is logical. Yet, when the structure was finished, it says, and Moshe saw all the work, and behold, they did it just as God had commanded them, and Moshe blessed them. Soon after it was completed, the divine presence settled within it, because the act of construction fulfilled the two criteria which form the pillars of the Torah. And this is why it's so important. The two criteria are, one, that a commandment must come from God. In other words, not man-made. Otherwise, it's not a commandment. And two, that the commandment must be accepted by the community wholeheartedly. The tabernacle fulfilled these two criteria since it was constructed as God's at God's command, and it was built by the entire community, as it says, from every person whose heart inspires him to give. It was done with the community's full desire and will, and the resting of the divine presence that followed was therefore completely appropriate, as it says, and I will rest in their midst. Then he goes on beautifully, and he explains how the reason why commandments have to be divinely inspired is because we don't understand the makeup of this world. Now, when I say we don't understand the makeup of this world, I don't mean that science can't get down to understanding that everything is made up of molecules and atoms and whatnot. Because that science has discovered. And there is no doubt about that. Obviously, there's always more to be discovered. But thank God there's been amazing advancements, and we really can understand and see what the world is actually made up of. But what we don't understand is not necessarily what everything is made up of, but why it's made up specifically that way, and that's what causes it to be this way or that way. The DNA between a human being and a monkey is extremely close. The DNA between a human being and a banana is also not that far off. And that's because we're all pretty much made up of the same stuff. And it's only God that can truly understand that when putting one thing together with another, does that draw down divinity or not? And only God can tell us that. No matter how much science is going to advance, we're never going to truly understand that. Just like we're never going to truly understand how to create anything from nothing. Like they tell the story about the atheist convention that gets together and they decide they're going to make a human being. They have all the right measurements, all the right makings. They can do it. So they have the big mound of dirt there in the middle of the convention. They have all the machines hooked up to it. They're about to get started. The lights are on. The show's about to start. All of a sudden, a heavenly voice rings out and God says, go get your own dirt. You think you're so smart, you're going to outsmart God. Who do you think created everything in the first place? And that's the idea of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, and why it had to be physical and so precise. It was because that's the only way to draw down the divinity. And that was the purpose of the creation of the tabernacle. And on this same vein, the Lubavitcher Rebbe points out something phenomenal. And that is, in many schools of thought and many different philosophies, there's an assumption that God is closer to spirituality than to physicality. That if something is spiritual, it must be closer to holiness, it must be closer to divinity, because how can physicality have anything to do with God, with holiness? And the truth is that God is not closer to spirituality than he is to physicality. They're both equally distant, because God, in his true infinity, is completely beyond all definition of physicality or spirituality. And because of that, they are both equally distant. And therefore, the truest expression of God is in a place where there is, as the mystics call it, nimne hamnimnois, the impossibilities of impossibilities. And that is where spirituality and physicality are there together as one, or neither are really truly there. That's why there's an amazing phenomenon that took place both in the tabernacle and in the both Beis HaMikdash. Well, the second one is a little bit questionable, so we won't get into that now. But simply, the walls of the Holy of Holies was roughly 20 amis wide. Let's say roughly 50 feet wide. Now, let's just keep it in the terms of amis of cubits for now. It was 20 cubits wide. The Aron, the Ark of the Covenant, was 2.5 amis wide, which would mean if it was stationed perfectly in between, and you measured on each side of the Ark, you should have had 8.75 cubits on one side, 8.75 on the other side, which would get you to 17.5, and in the middle, you would have 2.5, and boom, you have 20. However, that's not what happened. If you measured from one wall to the other wall, you came out with 20 cubits. If you measured from one wall to the Ark, you came out with 10 cubits. And from the other wall to the other end of the Ark, you came out with 10 cubits. What was going on over here? There was something called the Makim Ha'arin Einim Min Amida, which means that the Ark took up space at the same time that it took up absolutely no space. Why? It makes absolutely no sense. There's no way to explain it besides for the truest form of miracle, where there is finiteness and infinity in the same place at the same time, because that is the true expression of where God is. And the reason why this had to be in a physical housing is because that's exactly the point. Where do you have the truest expression of God? Not in physicality, not in spirituality, but in both, or when they can be fused together, and that they are not opposites. Because for the truly infinite God, there's no such thing as ultimate opposites. And this idea was to imbue within the Jewish people that the physical world is not a place, as we said before, devoid of godliness, but on the contrary, this was a place that we have to draw godliness into. It all started in the tabernacle or in the holy temple, and from there we drew our strength of how to affect the world around us. Now, to truly appreciate this, let's look at some of the details of the makeup of the tabernacle. And the Torah goes into 4 general materials that were used. One is gold, silver, copper, and dyed sheepskins, specifically red dyed, even though they were multicolored, but the way it describes it as red dye. And these were the 4 main ingredients that were crowd-funded, collected from the people, and used to build the entire tabernacle. Now, in telling us this, the Medrash points out something interesting. Why specifically these 4 ingredients, or these 4 materials, I should say? And the Medrash tells us as follows, that these 4 materials represent the 4 nations that exiled the Jewish people throughout our history. And it says that the gold that was used to construct the tabernacle represents the kingdom of Babylonia, who destroyed the Beis HaMikdash roughly in the year 440 or so, before the Common Era. That's BCE, before the Common Era, not before the COVID era. And that was Nebuchadnezzar and his army and the Babylonian kings who exiled the Jewish people, destroyed the first Beis HaMikdash. They are referred to in the prophet of Daniel as "you are the head of gold," referring to the kingdom of Babylonia. And from there, the gold represents the kingdom of Babylonia. The second material was silver. And we find that in the Megillah, the Persian nation are referred to, right? We're coming up on Purim just next week. And the Persian people are referred to as silver in the conversation between Haman and Achashverosh when talking about what to do with the Jewish people. And from there, the Medrash tells us that the silver component of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, represents the nation of Media or Persia. The third material was copper. And copper refers to the Greek kingdom. As we know, they may not have destroyed the Beis HaMikdash roughly 200 BC, before the Common Era, but they enslaved the Jewish people spiritually. We know how devastating of an effect they had on the Jewish people in a spiritual way, and we know the story of Hanukkah that took place with the Greeks and them trying to impose their ways of life on the Jewish people for hundreds of years. And they're represented as copper. The reason why copper is because they were the weakest of all the nations that tried to enslave us. And ultimately, the fourth material, which is the red dyed ram skin, represents the kingdom of Edom, who destroyed the second Beis Hamikdash roughly in the year 70 of the Common Era. And till today, we are still in that exile. And they're referred to as the Redskins. Why? Because we know that Esav, who was the progenitor of Edom, of Rome, they are represented by the fact that Esav was, and the first one emerged reddish, as we know that that's a description of Esav, and that's what the red dyed skins were to represent Esav. Now, this is nice, some nice connecting of the dots, really painting this tapestry for us. But at the same time, it's a little baffling. Why would the Torah, during the time where it discusses the whole idea of the building of the tabernacle, at this moment, why would God hint to the four nations that would eventually destroy it, both physically and spiritually? What's the purpose? As imagine, somebody's going to have to deal with something difficult later on. But right now they're celebrating. Why come crashing down on the celebration? Why not let the Jewish people enjoy this and then hint to it some way later? Now, in order to appreciate this, we're going to take a little bit of a different turn, and that is back to specifically in this week's Torah portion regarding the crowdfunding. We find that the Torah uses the word Terumah, which means to donate, 3 times. The first time it's used, it explicitly says what is being collected, and that is that we are collecting the first time it was about the collection of the dyed skins. Clearly states that that's what was being collected. The next 2 times, it doesn't clearly state what was being collected. And from this, our sages learn that one time was to collect for the sockets. There were silver sockets that upheld the entire structure. And the third time is to represent the money that was collected, actually the half a shekel that was collected, for the communal sacrifices that would be brought throughout the year. And we will commemorate this half shekel on Thursday, God willing, on Tanis Esther, the fast of Esther, by giving that in shul, and that's to commemorate that every single year that collection lives on ever since then. The other 2 collections for the sockets and for the rest of the materials, namely the hides that would cover the tent, obviously that was a one-time ordeal just for that generation, but the half shekel for the communal sacrifices goes on, and we commemorate it till this very day. So we have 3 things, 3 general collections. Now the question is, why would you have to make 3 separate collections for these 3 separate items? Why not just collect them all into one big pot together? Unless maybe it was like the charity where it was split up into different teams and each team had to raise funds for a different program, but that wasn't the case. We know it was all coming to the same place. It was all Moshe Rabbeinu collecting it on behalf of the Jewish people. And if that's the case, why the 3 separate collections? And secondly, how come only one of them is explicitly in the Torah? The other 2 had to be derived from the different nuances in the verses. How come the Torah couldn't just say clearly that these were 3 separate collections? Now, when it comes to these 3, it's not just random that we're using the number 3. And based on this idea, the sages point out that there is a Mishnah in the ethics of our fathers in Pirkei Avos, which reads as follows, that Shimon HaTzadik said that the entire world is based on, or really stands on, 3 things, and that is the learning of Torah, avoda, which is service to God, and which we know generally refers to prayer, and the third is gemilas chasadim, which means acts of kindness or kind deeds, essentially referring to mitzvahs. And these are the 3 pillars for the entire world. Now, what's the connection between that and these 3 collections? And very simple. One of the collections we said was for the silver sockets, which the wooden beams, which the entire tent, the tabernacle, stood upon, and these were their foundations. So when it comes to the foundation, we know that what is fundamental and what is a foundation for a Jewish person, that is Torah. To know and to be able to talk about anything Where do we know it all from? From the Torah. How do we know how God exists? What do we know about God? It all comes from the Torah. The Torah tells us who we are. The Torah tells us what mitzvahs are. The Torah tells us how to do mitzvahs. The Torah tells us everything that we need to know as a Jew. And that's why the Torah is represented by the sockets, which is the ultimate foundation. Now, building on top of that, what was done in the tent, in the tabernacle, and that is the karbanis, the sacrifices that were brought, the communal sacrifices, namely. And that was the second collection. What was the purpose of that? In other words, the whole purpose of a sacrifice, in short, I think we once gave a class on it last year, in the general concept of sacrifices. But the simple idea of a sacrifice is a connection and a relationship with God. And that is represented in avodah, in a person's prayer. The whole purpose of prayer is to connect with God, connect myself with God, to tame the animal within me, the selfish part of myself, to work on that, make it more selfless and one with God. The third collection, which was for the skins and the other materials, the hides, that is represented by the mitzvahs. You see, because what's the whole purpose of these materials? They were just to protect the tent and to make it look beautiful from the outside. And that's represented by gemilas chasadim, by the good deeds that we do, by the mitzvahs that we do. You see, because the first two categories are really all about me. When it comes to learning Torah, that's about educating myself. When it comes to bringing sacrifices, which was represented by prayer, we know that that's all about self-development, personal development, making me the best person I can. So once again, through educating myself and through working on myself to become a more selfless person and a person that's closer to God, more refined, spiritual, holy. However, the third criteria, when it comes to doing mitzvahs, it's not necessarily about me. It's about my engagement and my effect with the entire world around me. It's not about me anymore, but rather my imprint and my effect on the entire world around me. And that's represented in the rest of the materials of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle. These were all, so to say, exterior to what went on inside, almost irrelevant to what went on inside. Now, based on this idea, if somebody were to ask you, what is more, right? So we ultimately have two fundamental concepts here. One is self-development and self-perfection, and the second is action and our effect on the world. If you had to choose which one was more important, which one would you choose? Now, this is a great question, but not a new question. This question goes back to the times of the Talmud, where the Talmud discusses that Rabbi Tarfon and many sages, so this is from the Talmud in Tractate Kiddushin on page 40b. The Talmud says that they asked, what is greater, Talmud Gadol or Maisa Gadol? What is greater, learning or action? And the Gemara's conclusion is learning because it brings to action. Now, this isn't just the Gemara getting out of not answering a question by rephrasing it. Rather, what the Gemara is saying over here is as follows. The ultimate purpose and the ultimate goal is action, is our effect on the world around us. However, in order to be truly effective, you have to learn. You have to have the proper guidance and self-development. Otherwise, who knows where your actions will lead you? That's like a person walking into an operating room and saying, I love this person on the operating table, the patient, so much that I want to do everything I can for them. Let me in. Let me be the one to perform the action. And you turn to this person and say, did you ever go to medical school? He says, no, but I really want to do the right thing. You say, please wait outside. Or you throw them out because you don't belong there. Just because you want to do the right thing doesn't mean you're going to do the right thing. You need to have the proper guidance. You can't stand up and say, oh, let me be the one to act if you don't know what you're doing. It's great, it's noble, but it must be guided. And that's what it's telling us. So which one is greater? The ultimate purpose is action, but the guidance to get there is of extreme importance, that the action be truly effective and healthy. That's going to have to be guided through the Torah that a person learns and the prayer, the refining of one's character to make sure that it's always the right outcome. Now, based on this idea, we can appreciate why, out of the 3 donations, which we, like I said before, represent a person's learning Torah, prayer, and action, are represented by the 3 donations, one for the silver sockets, one for the sacrifices, and the third for the materials of the actual structure, namely the skins and the wood. Based on this, we can understand why only the collection for the raw materials is explicitly said in the Torah, versus when it comes to the sockets and the sacrifices, those are only hinted to. You see, because there was an understanding that God was intimating of the ultimate purpose that the Mishkan represented, and the message to the Jewish people is that everything, the whole entire purpose of everything, is to bring to practical action, to affecting the world in a positive way. The other 2 steps are important to get us there. Now, the reason why that's so important is because there would come a time where the Jewish people wouldn't have the tabernacle, where the Jewish people wouldn't have the first or second Beis HaMikdash, because they would be destroyed. And that was a reality that we were going to have to deal with in anyways. And this was God's message to us. If you want to truly understand the value of the tabernacle, you want to truly understand the value of the Holy Temple, don't get caught up in just the physical structure of it itself. Look at the idea that it's coming to teach us. And that is, ultimately, it's about action, and even action in the lowest and darkest of places, the positivity and the goodness that you can bring there. That is the most important thing. Now, while we have that physical structure, like we had for so many years, thousands of years ago, when we had the first or second Holy Temple, we had the tabernacle, we were able to see that physical manifestation and bring that to the world. But God was telling us one day that's going to stop. But I want you to know from the get-go what the most important thing is, so that even when the physical structure is destroyed, each and every one of you can carry out the mission of what this structure represented. And that is positive action and bringing out the best thing in the world around us through mitzvahs. Because there might come a time where we won't be as holy and spiritual and as well developed as in times before us. In the times of the first and second Beis HaMikdash, you had prophets, you had kings, you had great sages. We no longer have that anymore. We no longer are as spiritually in tune as they once were. But in the world of action, we're able to act just like they did, and even more so. And that's why even during the times where God was telling the Jewish people about just the materials of constructing, God made sure to specify the 4 types of materials that represented those who would try to rule over us, both physically and spiritually, to teach us this powerful lesson, that the only way we'll conquer over these nations, conquer over the negativity in the world, is when we can understand what the true point of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and both holy temples was, to bring about goodness and kindness in the world all around us, to make that positive change through specifically action. It's not about philosophizing. It's not about just personal and self-development, but bringing that out into the physical, real world around us and making that kind of change. And that is what ultimately the purpose that we're all here for. Like the famous saying of the Baal Shem Tov, that a soul waits to come down here, and that it comes down here for 70 or 80 years just to do one favor, one action for another person, be it physical, and for sure if it's a spiritual wellness that you can do for somebody else. And that's where the ultimate idea of action comes down to. It's what I do for other people. It's what I do for those around us, and how I make the world a better place. And this is a fundamental concept in the way of understanding the world around us and the way of understanding our role and our mission here. I'd like to conclude with a story that took place in Samarkand not so long ago. This story was told over by Rabbi Hillel Zaltzman, who fled the Soviet Union, and like many Jews who were running away, spent a lot of time in Samarkand and ultimately came to America and Canada. And he says like this. Rabbi Hillel Zaltzman tells us as follows. He says, once during a Hebrew writing lesson, my friend Mordechai Goldschmidt forgot his inkwell And this, you have to understand where the world was when this story was taking place. Thousands upon thousands, if not millions of Jews were being slaughtered left, right, and center. Oppression was everywhere. And this is the middle of Russia, I'm assuming. And he writes as follows, right? So his friend forgets his inkwell. And he writes, I didn't want to let him dip his pen into my inkwell and told him that he should have brought his own. It says, Reb Benche, who was their teacher, noticed this, but said nothing. After a while, he asked me, Hilke, did you say Moida'ani today? Moida'ani is the first prayer of the day, an acknowledgement of God, recited immediately upon waking up each morning. I said that I had. Reb Benche asked me to explain the Moida'ani, which I did to the best of my ability. Reb Benche stopped me and said, that is not what it means. And he went on to explain it. Moida'ani means, Moida, which means to thanks, means to be selfless. This means that when a friend asks for ink, you give it to him. Ani, which literally means I, means that when your friend asks you for a pen, you must give him a pen. And he went on to explain the rest of the words in a similar fashion. Then he said, now do you know the meaning of Moida'ani? These scenes typified his method of education, and they have remained etched in our souls for life. This is the way that the Hasidim were educating their children back when nobody had anything and oppression was everywhere. So we can understand specifically in our times, in our day and age, the responsibility that we have towards each other and the world around us to make it a better and brighter place. Thank you for joining us tonight.